Okay, so I'm really happy to see you here this afternoon and to have the occasion to discuss together this topic. So if you've come to hear something about Japanese language, you're in the wrong room, yeah? Here we're going to be talking about whether we have a different personality when we speak a different language, and to which extent, or what you think about it, and some research results on the topic. Welcome, everybody. Feel free to take a seat. All right. So, the ones who were here yesterday evening at the opening ceremony have heard this Slovak proverb already a couple of times. It says like this: Koľko jazykov vieš, toľkokrát si človekom. Remember, these people mentioned it yesterday, and it means something like, the more languages you know, the more of a person you are. So I thought it would be appropriate, because we're all polyglots and we're all in Slovakia. Welcome in, everyone. Take a seat. It's only hardly started. You're still on time. All right, so I'm really happy to be in this country talking about this topic in a country where humanity or degree of humanity increases with the number of languages we speak. And I wanted to introduce myself, and I didn't really know where to start, apart from saying my name. Hey, I'm Cécile. And I thought that maybe what characterized me the most is that I'm a serial expat. By this, I mean that I've lived in several foreign countries. When I say lived, I mean for 6 months up to 17 years. So not linguistic stays, not long holidays, really lived. And this is what got me here today, because I started thinking about this language switching and how this was affecting me as a person. For example, 1 minute you're talking to your flatmates, joking, arguing, and the next minute you're on Skype talking to your parents using yet a completely different language, a completely different register. And so that got me wondering. And I have the impression that you are also wondering if, and this is why I have a question for you, because I have this unique opportunity. It's my first polyglot gathering. So it's the first time I come across so many polyglots and language learners and enthusiasts. So I'm going to take advantage of the situation and use you as much as I can. So here is one question that I have for you. Do you think that you have the same personality, the exact same personality, in the different languages that you speak? So hands up the people who think that they do. They're just one person with the same personality, right? And hands up the people who think that they have a slightly different personality, depending on the language. Okay, very interesting. We'll get back, because you haven't seen, but I have counted more or less roughly, and we'll go back to these results together. All right, so there was a majority of people who said that, I feel that my personality might be slightly different depending on the language I speak. And I would like to ask these people, why? Why is this? Why do you have this feeling? Is it because you learned all these different languages in different contexts? For example, I have an anecdote. It's about a friend of mine, so I won't tell her name. She might not talk to me again otherwise. Anyways, when I met this girl, we started speaking English. And she was really sweet, discreet, well-educated. She had learned English at school. After a while, she switched back to Croatian, which was her mother tongue, and she started burping out loud. And I was really taken aback that 5 minutes earlier, it was a completely different person. And then, after an hour of talking, we discovered that our main common language was actually Spanish. And then she started, "Que bueno, mi amor!" And she started applauding. And I was like, oh my God, is this girl suffering schizophrenia? And it turned out that she had learned Spanish by watching telenovelas. So every time she learned Spanish, she would open her mouth wide and articulate and over-exaggerate her feelings and emotions and gestures, yeah? So all these different contexts might affect the way, not only the way you feel, but also the way you come across to other people. And we'll get into this in a bit more depth now. So some of you probably have different linguistic repertoires in the different languages that you speak. For example, I don't know, maybe one of you knows all the names of all the mushrooms in French, but might not know them in another language they're fluent in. Or maybe you can talk about linguistics until 3 a.m. tonight in German, but you wouldn't be able to do the same or in the same depth in English, etc. Do you have these different linguistic registers, repertoires? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see people nodding. Okay, so I'm not an alien. Then it might be because of different cultural frames. For example, let's say that you learned, okay, this is a bit of a cliche, but let's say that you learned Italian in a really family-centered culture where la mamma, la nonna are really important. But maybe you learned English in a typical UK environment where the children have tea earlier and go to bed, and the parents have dinner separately. So this also might affect the way you speak and you act. So cultural frames. Maybe you have different autobiographical memories in these different languages. Maybe one of the languages you speak is associated to your childhood. Maybe it's the language you grew up in. You know all the nursery rhymes. And maybe another language is more associated with your adulthood, work, your professional career. And all these autobiographical associations might have positive or negative impact. I don't know if any of you has had a traumatic childhood. Please don't raise your hand. You don't have to. Or all the contrary, you feel nostalgic when you think back to these years. So all this also affects the way you come across in a language and maybe the personality you adopt while speaking it. Then you might have different levels of emotionality. Maybe you've had some tough learning experience in a language. Maybe you were trying hard to utter 3 words and trying your best and you got negative feedback. Whereas in another language, you have exactly the same level in. Everybody was cheering you up and yeah, oh wow, you're so fluent and this is so wonderful. And maybe your attitude is then different. Maybe you feel in that language where you didn't have this support, you might feel more frustrated or even shy. And in the other one, you feel that, oh, you're speaking much more naturally. And then, who doesn't know the common framework of reference for languages? The European one. You all do, right? A1, A2. And I think that you come across very differently if you're at one end of the spectrum, A1, A2, or at the other one, you're a native speaker, you're C1, C2. You're not going to have the same degree of abstraction and depth in what you say. So all these things, all these different contexts might affect your personality. I would like to present this book, Bilingual Minds. It was edited by Aneta Pavlenko a few years ago, and we only have half an hour, so I will only just hint to a couple of studies. This lady interviewed over 1,000 polyglots, And surprisingly enough or not, she got empirical data, we'll come back to this, and you remember when you raised your hand, she asked her polyglots the same question that I did at the beginning. Do you feel that you have the exact same personality in all languages? And the result is really very correlated to what we got here a few minutes ago. So 65% said, no, I'm not exactly the same in all these languages. And the way she collected the data was actually very interesting because although she's an academic, she asked some open questions, like the one I asked earlier, but she asked a second one. Why is this? Why do you feel different? What makes you feel? And then from that, she extracted the concepts and the theoretical conclusions that we're going to talk about. So on the one hand, she had a group of immigrants and expatriates who clearly established a link between language, culture, and personality. So to summarize, the thinking, the behavior, even the perception of self and the world was changing when the language was changing, according to these respondents. There was another subgroup that established a link between the language and socialization. By socialization, they meant where and how they acquired that language. In a nutshell, they came to say that the language they speak affected the way they think. And it's very interesting that these immigrants and expatriates are bilingual, multilingual people or polyglots, because they didn't make a difference in the study, who speak the different languages in monolingual contexts. Because in bilingual or trilingual contexts, when you're in a bilingual community, you get different phenomena. I think that you're familiar with, such as code switching. You know, when you start one sentence in one language, y la terminas en otro, and you finish it in another one. Or code mixing. For example, some South American communities in the United States, Spanish and English speaking, have this kind of code mixing. For example, when they want to say, oh, I vacuumed the carpet, they would say in Spanish, vacuno la carpeta, which would literally mean I'm vaccinating the folder. So this is code mixing. So code mixing and code switching, no. Like all these links that we were talking about before are much more diluted in this kind of communities. So I don't know if it's your case, if you're polyglots, but speaking your languages mostly in monolingual contexts? Or does any of you live in this kind of bilingual communities? Does anyone? Okay, interesting. So we can talk a bit later about this a bit more, maybe after the talk. I would be interested. All right, other respondents, remember, out of these 1,000 plus polyglots, felt that when speaking another language, they were putting on an act, wearing a mask. They felt that they were a little bit fake. I don't know if you're familiar with Jung's philosophy. They didn't feel like a different person. They felt like a different persona, that they were acting different. And why can this be? And in this group, it seemed that maybe it was because the second language, or third, etc., and counting, they weren't so good, so they didn't have such a good command of that second or third language as they did of their mother tongue. Others might be because the community they're trying to integrate in and communicate with had different expectations. And we found out that these who answered like this, that, oh, they were feeling a little fake, had usually learned a first language earlier in life and then the others. And the others might not feel as natural. All right. Those who raised your hand at first, saying that, yes, I think that I have the same personality in all languages, you're not alone. So 25% of the respondents thought the same, and you might be wondering, 65 plus 25, that doesn't work out 100. Okay, because 10% of the people gave ambiguous responses, didn't reply, etc. And these people who said, yes, I have the same personality, it was very interesting because they didn't elaborate their answers so much. The answers were very short, to the point, yes, I do, goodbye. Whereas the ones who thought that they had different personalities were much more inclined to justify and explain, and why is that, and how do they feel, etc. But they all coincided in saying that they had one unitary self that was unaffected by the change of language, but enriched by it. And it's really funny or symptomatic that in all these answers, there was always a but, a however, as if they presupposed or assumed that the others thought that, yes, there should be a difference, but they didn't believe in it. So that was a bit curious. All right, let's imagine now we're in a dream world. All of us are perfect multilingual speakers. By this, I mean that we learned all our languages simultaneously and to the exact same level of proficiency. We're brilliant. Even in this case, have a look here. I'm going to take a few examples from Spanish, but just why not? Okay, the sounds that you use. For example, if you say está or está, or the morphology, if you say poco, poquito, poquillo, poquinho, the syntax, whether you use verbal periphrases with prepositions or one lexicalized verb, the vocabulary, you might say tomate or jitomate. And all these differences will make you perceived differently among the speaking community. And here we're going to briefly talk about sociolinguistics. As you all know, here it will be the social group within which you learned this language. Because maybe you became fluent in English by contact with urban academics, but you're just as fluent in Italian. Remember, we're perfect, we have the same level of proficiency. But you learned from rural farmers. It's possible. Or geographical varieties. You learned your English in Oxford, at Oxford University, or Spanish in Granada, in Andalusia. And here there's a question of prestige and stigma coming in. Because some of these varieties within the speaking communities are more prestigious than others. Some are seen as the norm, standard, whereas others are not so prestigious, or they might even be stigmatized. So even if in this really ideal case that we speak perfectly, we might be using different varieties, and even though we are ourselves, others might think that, oh, this person is a little bit arrogant, or she's of a very low social condition, or whatever, but you're still yourself. And you switch the language, and the others will have a completely different impression. No, the reality now, we are all polyglots, And it's very likely that the languages we've learned them either simultaneously or consecutively, and we have different levels of proficiency. Some of you have even had the courtesy to indicate it on their little tag, so that we would know how fluent you are. All right, I have one question for you, another one. Does any of you swear more in one or two of the languages that you speak than in the others? Why is that? Is it because in the culture?
I think some people can visit us off a lot.
So it's their fault, yeah? Is the speaking community pissing you off and triggering?
Because we can't make something and then we just don't choose the language.
All right, I hadn't thought of this possibility. So some speaking communities might be more annoying than others. Interesting. I had thought about two possible explanations. One is about taboo. Maybe in some cultures, swearing is much more taboo than in others, and you feel freer in the others to just let it out. I won't give any example. Yes?
For example, I learned about Guatemala. I spent a little bit of time in Guatemala, and I learned that it's just not the done thing for a woman to swear. It would be very uncouth. Whereas in Spain, my girlfriends, they just swear the hell out of me,
Interesting. So there might be some.
It's not considered something, that's not becoming because you're a woman. I don't swear because.
All right. So there might be a gender difference in countries like Guatemala.
Yeah, there are gender differences. I think in
Interesting.
some South American countries, women are not supposed to swear, but in Spain they swear.
Oh, they do, yeah. All right. Or maybe another possible explanation of why you swear more in one language than in another might be because these insults or swear words sound much stronger in your mother tongue than they do in another acquired language. Mm-hmm.
My son used to, I'm German, my son was born in Belgium, and he used to complain to me that I don't swear. He said, Mom, all the other parents are swearing, why don't you swear?
If that was the only complaint he had, I think.
It just didn't come naturally to me.
Of course. All right. The last research results that I will present here come from this article called Do Bilinguals Have Two Personality? A Special Case of Cultural Frame Switching. So cultural frame switching, remember I talked about this family-centered culture in Italy and this individual-centered culture in the UK, just as an example. Well, this is it. The big five. So we're not talking about elephants and giraffes here. We're talking about the big five in psychology. So these are the five big main personality traits that you can find in any human being. Openness to experience. So of course we have, again, two ends of the spectrum. Yeah? On the one end, you might be inventive, curious, whereas on the other end, you might be more cautious and consistent. Then we have conscientiousness. So you're efficient, organized, or easygoing and a bit careless. Shall I start swearing at you? I'm kidding. All right. Extroversion. So you might be either outgoing, energetic, or on the other end, solitary, reserved. Agreeableness. Are you friendly? Are you compassionate? Or are you more challenging and detached? Neuroticism. Are you nervous, sensitive, or are you confident and secure? I'm sure each of us has all these different personality traits within him or herself to different degrees. But the interesting thing is that there were general tendencies within cultures. And this is what this study was based on. So basically, they first conducted a first part of the study. They made monolingual speakers from the US, so English native speakers, and from Mexico, Spanish natives, answer the same type of questions. And they found some statistically significant differences. For example, it turned out that the English speakers in the US were more extroverted, agreeable, conscientious, and open than their counterparts in Mexico. And the native Spanish speakers from Mexico had higher levels of sensitivity, nervousness, so neuroticism. And the idea of that study was like, okay, we've studied the monolinguals, let's see if a polyglot, when speaking these two different languages, also switches. For example, if I'm a Mexican-Spanish speaker, am I less nervous, more self-confident when speaking American English? Yeah. So they conducted the study in Mexico and the States with bilingual people. And here you can see, so on the left, you have the results from the monolinguals. So you can see neuroticism was the only one that was higher for the Spanish-speaking community. And you might have already noticed that it correlates. So when this bilingual person speaks, it's the same person, but when they speak American English, they're more outgoing than when they speak Spanish. Have you noticed that there's one personality trait that's missing there? Openness. And this will not come as a surprise to you, polyglots, that bilingual or multilingual people or polyglots are more open than the rest, yeah? So this was a bit of a contradiction, and the psychologists conducting this test had a hard time trying to justify it, but I think to us, this is no big deal. I think we get it, that, to quote the Slovaks again, the more languages you speak, the more human you are. So I've heard one piece of advice as a conclusion that goes like this. When you're learning a foreign language, you should try to do what you enjoy doing in your mother tongue or the other languages you already master. For example, if you're a fan of thriller movies, you might just want to watch these kind of films. Or if you enjoy spending time playing cards with your friends, just do that in the new language you're trying to learn. But I have one suggestion for you. I would like to invite you to try sane schizophrenia. By this I mean, you might want to give it a go when learning your next new language, to try to explore more different aspects of your personality that you haven't really explored yet. You might want to discover new talents. Maybe start learning how to cook for the first time, or study anthropology in that new language, although you know nothing about anthropology. So yeah, I would just like to invite you to explore these inner worlds and connect with this humanity, more humanity that Slovaks talk about. So if you have any questions, doubts, critiques, anything, feel free to express yourselves.
Okay, well, I think that humans have a tendency to copy each other, to imitate each other while interacting, to some extent and for whatever their reason is. And does this multiple personalities thing surface only when interacting with native speakers, or is it a universal thing?
Well, as I mentioned, but maybe I didn't put enough emphasis on this, in these studies, it was when these multilingual speakers or polyglots were interacting within monolingual communities. So, for example, you're bilingual, I don't know, with Galician and English, but when speaking Galician to a Galician-speaking community, yes, and this is where this cultural frame switching appears, because you want to integrate, you want to be part of that community, and that affects you as an individual. Yeah, well pointed. Mm-hmm.
So it's not maybe the matter of language that much as interacting as humans.
Exactly, because languages are meant for communication, and well, you might be talking to yourself, but in most cases you will end up talking to more people out there, and this is when these little changes might happen.
So I change my personality because I'm changing the language, but because I'm interacting with a different person.
Exactly, it's a social behavior. Language is part of a bunch of social things. We were only talking about language, but there's also non-verbal communication. There's a lot more to it, yeah.
May I also share something? Sure. Everyone has to be the last thing. Okay, sure. Well, I just wanted to confirm your words, teacher. So this is also true. I noticed this, for example, whenever I would speak with Latin American folks and also Italians, so they are really cheerful and really joyful. So it's not always like because of Latin American TV shows. It is also because of their way of reaction. So, for example, if I would listen to some Mexican like, "Hola, ¿cómo estás? ¡Qué padre!" So then it's impossible not to laugh, you know, and body language and so on. So because of that, it's really hard to me to swear in their native language, you know, not because I don't know, it's just because I don't wish it. So it's, while, for example, in English, I used to swear. So at least that, but
All right, so we're going to leave on this joyful note. Thank you very much for coming.